Geoff is here with us. We're going to go for an hour. It's coming up to 10:20 now. So Geoff Ellwand is a veteran CBC Radio reporter attached to CBC Radio News in Toronto in a formal way, and I would say perhaps more informally, but very realistically attached to the whole Toronto production unit of CBC Radio, Radio 1. I'm talking about programs such as Metro Morning, Here and Now in the afternoon, and the noon program and so forth, and also the network programming in Toronto for news and public affairs, especially news, such as World Report in the morning, the 1/2 hour production called The World at 6 in the afternoon as well. So Geoff is a locally based CBC Radio News reporter in Toronto. So would you like to step up, Geoff, and you can say a few introductory remarks if you like, and we'll ask some questions, we'll invite questions, and I'll have some questions of my own as well.
Thanks, Ted. I was just going to kind of clear the decks before I started, and that is if Ted suggested in any way that I had any answers about ethics, issues about ethics, he was misleading you. I mean, the debate that I saw here a little while ago, in which each of you presented, or many of you presented, divergent views, are exactly the same thing that goes on in active news units. And everybody wrestles with those concerns, but ultimately some kind of decision has to be made and we have to go forward. So what I was thinking of doing today, perhaps, was touching on a few recent things which have come up in the newsroom, tell you more or less the thinking that went into the decision we made, and then we could talk about it. But there's certainly no right or wrong about where to go on many of these things. One issue you'll recall that has engaged everybody recently was the Dawson College killings, where a young man walked into Dawson College in Montreal, opened fire, killed, I forget, 1, 2 people? One, injured several others, no apparent motive. And it got enormous coverage, live coverage at one point on CBC Radio and television, and perhaps other outlets, I'm sure on other outlets. Huge newspaper coverage, front page coverage. Then if the reporters found out that the perpetrator had a website, and again, big coverage of his writings, his picture, and so on. About the same time, there were several other incidents in both the United States and Canada that bore a similarity to Dawson College. So this raised the issue, the ethical issue about copycat killings, about how much does any news organization report, how much do they show, how do they play it, what do they do, aware that particularly when it comes to these shootings in schools, there is a tendency for copycat things to occur, and you can imagine where the news managers and the reporters are when, what do? How much do they report? How do they report it? Now, you probably have a pretty good idea of the coverage that went into it, and in the Dawson College, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Ted, but the killings in the States, was it Mennonites, or that came afterwards, didn't it? Yeah. And whether the Americans had any coverage of Dawson College or not, I don't know, or it was just a sort of a back page story, I don't know. And then subsequent to that, there was an incident out west somewhere, as I recall. So it does raise the issue of copycat killings, or copycat actions. And the CBC wrestled with that issue. Initially, when it came up, CBC went live because it was a big incident. Nobody knew exactly what it was. It started out to sound like a big hostage taking at a school. Thoughts about potential terrorism and such like no doubt went through the minds of people as they scrambled to get there and start to cover it. Then over the hours it evolved into somebody, no motive, no clear motive seems to have come out doing this crazy, destructive, terrible act. And so Initially, the news agencies decided to cover it because it looked like a big hostage taking, and it was taking place in the heart of one of Canada's biggest cities. And then when the internet angle revealed, particularly with pictures, then that became, very difficult not to run. And so we on radio didn't run any pictures, so we can't be accused of that. Though on our website we did run pictures. So the decision was made to go ahead and use the pictures and do it. So this raised the issue about copycat killings. When we look back over our coverage, and I'm sure all the other agencies look back over their coverage, they were probably satisfied that they told a story that had to be told without sensationalizing it a long way. But never, inevitably there was criticism, and it came. So that's just one of the issues, and there's all sorts of other examples about it. One argument is that, what can you do? You don't report on the thing, which seems almost an impossibility. The other is that the whole copycat killing thing is just a figment of overwrought imaginations, because any killing, any incident that's reported, potentially is a guide for someone to do a similar thing. Bombings, actually something which we hardly ever hear of anymore, except when we hear about Air India, but it's sort of dropped off dramatically, partly because of increased security. But that is bombing of airplanes. It's very, very rare, bombing of airplanes, extremely rare. Now, as I say, part of that could come from, undoubtedly part of that comes from increased security, but still, it's kind of dropped off and particularly bombing of, it used to be, quite frequently airplanes were bombed by people who had some kind of financial reason, or they wanted to get rid of their wife or husband, or they wanted to collect insurance or something. It was a relatively common occurrence, and then it just kind of vanished. So I suppose that might lend some fuel to the idea about copycat crime. Nevertheless, it's an issue that's out there. And even today, I was looking at something which raises another issue I want to talk about as well. And that's the issue of identifying suspects. It's kind of linked into this copycat killing, so just bear with me while I get to this. That an issue which has been debated in newsrooms is how much identification do we give of suspects in crimes? There's also a racial element to the whole thing, because the police will put out something, they'll say 3 men, an East Indian man and 2 black men wearing baggy pants and the hats on backwards, knocked over a milk store, let's say. So as media outlets, should we report that an East Indian man and 2 black men wearing baggy pants and hats on backwards robbed it? Are we contributing anything to the chances of these guys getting arrested by publishing that, and at the same time mentioning their race? The debate became that if you mention the race of people all the time, then people might get the perception that all the crime that's being committed in the city is being committed by East Indians or blacks or whatever. Or in other communities, of course, which have large Aboriginal populations, for example, largely because of economic circumstances, a lot of Aboriginal people are involved in these low-level crimes, and as a consequence, if you report all the time that the suspects were Aboriginal, then that gives the general population the idea that all crime is being committed by Aboriginals. It's an extremely sensitive issue, and what major media organizations in Canada, certainly in Toronto, have decided is that they won't mention the race of a suspect unless it's really germane to identifying the person. And what made me think of this is that there are pictures published in the paper today of 2 young men who appear to be of African heritage, who are involved in robbing a taxi driver. I don't know if you've seen the pictures, very dramatic, man's holding a big, young man. These are underage people too, in addition to everything else. The police received judicial permission to publish their pictures. Now, we will use those pictures probably because while they do obviously identify the race of the person, it is germane to getting the information out to the public so that these people might be identified. So race is in fact incidental to the issue of the identification. So I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm saying that this is the conclusion that major media organizations have achieved. And the link in with the copycat business is that some kid is going to, one could argue, somebody is going to see a picture of some kid with a big gun, looking very dangerous and exciting, sitting in the back of a cab with a terrified taxi driver in front. You could argue that that's going to inflame someone who's inclined to do something like that, to do the same thing. In fact, the cab driver says he told the kids that they were being videotaped. So did they want to get their picture in the paper? You wonder. So this is where the issue, it's all very muddy about the issues of reporting on crimes and whether they result in copycat killings. So before I move on, I'd be very interested to hear what you guys think. What would you do if you were the photo editor of a newspaper or the editor in a TV station or a reporter? What you would do on the issue A of copycat killings and B on the issue of identifying suspects. Anybody got any thoughts about that? Yes.
Well, I'm not sure if are there substantial studies that suggest there's an increase of certain kind of crime once it's reported, or is it that just the media sort of tends to gravitate to similar stories when they occur? So I don't know about that, but in this particular case, it seems like it would make sense to publish the photos of people because you have the photos of the people, they're wanted. It would aid in the apprehension of them, I guess. Or
Sure.
Yeah, well, I would go along with that. I would say publish photos. If you think there is a concern about public perceptions about crimes being committed by a certain race group, one could then rather do a story about that aspect to try and rectify preconceived ideas out there in the public, instead of trying to censor yourself and saying, I'm not going to publish a picture just because I don't want to create wrong perceptions, then rather have additional articles to rectify any misperceptions that might be out there amongst the public. I mean, there's always, like, for example, if there's often socio-economic circumstances related to criminal behavior and so on. Like the example you mentioned about the Aborigines, and you can then cover that through additional articles.
And with respect to the copycat killings, I remember, I think it was the Amish school in the
Amish, sorry, that was it, yeah.
Where he boarded up the school. I not long after that, on Steve Pakin's show, the new one, the Agenda, they had like a panel discussion with, I think, 4 guests, and 2 of them were arguing that this is sort of contributing to copycat killings, the coverage. But I think that there are 2 things that most people can agree on, and one is that it's newsworthy that this has happened. So I think it should be covered, definitely. And ultimately, the people, like, the person with the gun is the person who's responsible for doing this. And I think it's unreasonable to peg. You certainly can't blame the media for someone going out and killing somebody. It's the person who's gone out and killed somebody who's to blame. And I just, like, I mean, I think that's important to remember. Don't forget who the criminals are. Like, it is a newsworthy thing for someone to go into a school. And I can understand that might egg someone on or give someone a similar idea. But I would never say that I don't see the logic in saying that the media is responsible for someone going out and killing someone.
And I want to get your question. I just want to put another page in our little discussion here, because you touched on an issue about copycat killings. Most media organizations don't report on suicides or bomb threats. I heard a long time ago there was some kind of studies, though I couldn't point you to them or identify them, that people in a suicidal frame of mind could be triggered into a suicidal act if they heard about a suicide. So most media organizations tend not to report suicides unless they become of a public matter. You may recall a couple of weeks ago, a man threw his children, I believe it was, off a balcony and then jumped himself. It was such a horrible thing that there had to be some explanation for his death, so that was widely reported. It wasn't framed so much in terms of a suicide as a man jumping off after having killed his children. We hear about on the subway all the time, the subway has been stopped, there's a medical emergency at such and such, the subway's delayed. Often, these are people jumping in front of the train, the subway train. So they don't. Or sometimes the Don Valley's been stopped because of a problem on the Don Valley because somebody jumped off the viaduct. So the media organizations self-censor themselves in the belief that it could trigger a bad action. The same business about bomb threats, because they don't do anything, and when you report bomb threats, the argument goes, there tends to be lots of bomb threats. So I just throw that into the copycat discussion we're having. Go ahead.
It seemed I think that's kind of interesting that those sorts of things are self-censored, I guess. Wouldn't it be more informative, or, I don't know, just to actually discuss why so many people are throwing themselves over bridges or in front of trains? Like, wouldn't that be a more insightful discussion as opposed to just ignoring?
Well, I don't think that media censors itself on discussing the issue of suicides. For example, there's a big debate over putting up those nets on the Bloor Viaduct. It's just it tends to be the individual suicides. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to go back to what Greg said on how it's almost as if you have to report those things because it's the person that's pulling the trigger. It's not the gun that's killing the people. It's almost by saying that if you don't publish stories like this, you're saying to the public, you're too susceptible to this information, you're going to go out and you're going to do it. So it's almost calling the public stupid in that sense.
I don't think in the case, unfortunately, the debate is kind of tougher than that. If it was just a simply matter of, are we going to cover it or not going to cover it, that's one thing. But that the issue is, how far do you go? Because you just couldn't not cover the Dawson College thing. I mean, that would be irresponsible not to cover it. And you could not cover it because, could you imagine if all the news agencies didn't report it, the rumors that would be going around? Hey, the huge thing happened in Montreal, the cops were there, people were killed, the news media never reported it. I mean, it would create a kind of a negative, frightening quality to it, and it'd be contrary to what we do. You know, as journalists, we're supposed to bring light on the darkness. So I don't think the debate really is don't cover it. The debate is how much should it be covered, and there is no answer to how much. I'd strongly argue that we should cover it, but how much do we cover it? Where do we stop? Where does it? You know, there is no book that tells us. We have to individually decide these things when they happen.
I think that with like a case like the Dawson College shooting and also the Amish school in the States, is that it's an sort of an inherently sensational story. Like the Toronto Sun will sensationalize anything or make news out of things that aren't even really news. But I mean, something like that it's an incredible story, right? And I think that just that fact alone is it's just gonna draw a huge amount of attention to it, and people, like, especially with things like the CBC. I remember coming home after class that day and putting it on Newsworld, and I sat there, that was the first time I heard of it, and I sat there for 2 hours, and they're getting all these live eyewitness testimonials and things. It's a huge story, and I think that the public sort of demands that kind of coverage.
But where as an editor, a news editor, report? Well, as a reporter, I guess you go out there and you get the info, and it's up to the other guys to decide what goes to air. But I mean, where do you draw the line? Where does your gut say that's enough? Got to stop. There isn't really an answer, but you know, each when we're confronted with that situation, the decision will have to be made.
Question. You mentioned during the break as well the incident in Toronto. the Union Station incident.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's related to this, how far do you go? This was the incident in which there was a hostage taking outside of Union Station one morning during the, the AM drive time, and a police sniper shot the guy, the fellow, dead. And Geoff was telling me that, everybody had tape, everybody had video of this, but the actual act itself was not shown. And this is generally the stance that the media would take, that there's just so far that they're willing to go in terms of being explicit when you actually have the police killing on tape.
Well, in that particular incident, which I happened to be at, so I know a little bit about it, but I have to be quite graphic. When the man was shot, he was shot in the head, and it resulted in a rather horrifying scene. And it was caught on camera, but the editors everywhere decided that even though they had the picture, they weren't going to use it because it was unpalatable to the public to see a bullet blowing somebody's head off, or not off, but however, it would be interesting, if you think about that, and then you start thinking about the discussion you had earlier about listening to the babies cry. I mean, a hostage taking, I hear about hostage takings all the time. Guy got shot, okay, big deal. But when you see somebody get shot, then it becomes somebody getting shot. And I suppose, you could move it into the area of the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Let's just stick with Iraq for a moment. There's various arguments, but it appears that there may be some management on the part of the United States forces not to show too many funerals. Well, you can bet that they're trying to make sure they don't show any shots of people actually getting shot, though I understand YouTube has been running some stuff about snipers picking people off. So, war, and there's so many casualties and such like. When we speak about these things, they don't carry the same weight as when we see something like that. Now, I gather you were talking about a photograph of a child in a body bag?
Yes, this was a case study from one of the books, and it was an American example. It was a young child who had drowned at a beach. And there was a family standing around, in distress, crying, children standing around, and the open body bag was right there on the beach. They had retrieved the body from the water, and it was a fairly close-up shot. I have it in my book if you'd like to see it. And that was published in a newspaper in the United States, and great debate over how explicit how you should be in publishing those types of photographs. So the Union Station example, everybody had the video, and 15, 20 years ago, that would be, in a sense, the end of the story, because that video wouldn't get out anywhere. There would be no media for that video to get onto. Geoff has just alluded to YouTube and other sites on the internet. So now we may have a case where this video gets to the public anyway in a different way, in a different medium. And maybe should that change the rules of journalism then? Maybe should journalists become more willing to run that kind of video? Not to rerun it and rerun it and rerun it, but to include the fact that we have video of the hostage taker actually being shot. And we will run it with a disclaimer, but we will run it. I don't know whether that's the way to go these days.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, and it's interesting because now YouTube is that sort of site, that public site where anybody can throw up their video. So is that sort of taking precedent, and people are saying, well, we're not getting the truth from the media sources, so we're going to turn to other public sources to find it. When do journalists and when do they have to just say, the certain amount of things we can't withhold from the public, but to a certain extent, we have to publish that. But when it's discretionary, like when is it our turn to step in and show it, and when is it, good for them not to see it just because they know enough about it for other things. So that's interesting to talk at.
Yeah.
I think, what's the difference between, when we were discussing the photo of the child, I think what came up a lot of the time was that they didn't know they were being photographed. It was telephone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But someone who's in the war, who's an officer in the stage in the middle of a busy downtown street. I mean, they must have some sense that they're going to be photographed. This is, you know, if you're in the Army, you know that, you know, your life is going to become an open book, I guess. So what's the difference there? Is there any consideration for something that is considered like a public forum, like a war, or someone who's grieving without the knowledge that they're being photographed?
You know, that the privacy issue, I don't know if it plays exactly into, I'm not sure that I would argue that it plays right into what you're talking about, a picture of a soldier getting shot. But that's another thing, the privacy issue. There was a picture, now this was when Clinton was president, you guys, I don't know if you remember it, but there was an incident where Clinton was, it was a bit unclear. Photographers were allowed to take pictures, or they were being kept back, or somebody somehow, but it was a picture of Clinton dancing with his wife on the beach. Do you remember that, Ted? And there became a debate, and this was when Clinton was in the throes of public criticism because of his various dalliances. And so supporters of Clinton and his wife liked the picture so much that they published it. So the question was raised, you know, here's a public figure, he was supposedly a private minute on the beach. Should it have been published? It caused a big debate. Then other people said, well, these are the Democrats or Clinton supporters trying to put a human face on Clinton, and it's actually the media is being duped. And I also remember Hillary Clinton saying, because the picture showed Bill, you see Bill's face and you see the back of Hillary, and Hillary said, who was denying this was any kind of setup, said, these are her words, no woman over 40 would knowingly permit herself to be photographed from behind. So, which might have just been a very clever Hillary Rodham Clinton way of diffusing the issue or not. But, I mean, these issues come out about how intrusive should you be. There was another very famous incident, I'm reaching back several years here, but there was a live television broadcast of the launch of I forget the number of it, but a space shuttle that blew up in the launch. And the cameras kept, because I guess they didn't know where, they showed the picture of the thing blowing up, and then they kept flashing back to the family of the woman, I believe she was the first woman, to the family standing there kind of looking at this scene. And I mean, the horrifying thoughts were going through their minds, you know, and you know, nobody knew what happened or if anybody was killed, but the space shuttle blew up. And there was a lot of criticism of that afterwards, that it was intrusive. In the Amish thing, there was efforts to keep the media back from the Amish community, by the Amish community, and then there were similar efforts to get pictures and stuff of the funeral and so on. So there is this line of intruding into the private world or the public world, or the private world of public figures, and how much does one do? When I think as reporters you're going to face is when you go to a crime scene or something, there's sometimes there'll be relatives or friends nearby who are distraught. Do you talk to them? Do you show the picture? There's then the famous thing in the print of going, they call the pickup, where you go to the home of someone who's been murdered or killed or somehow died, and you ask for a picture of them, which is so important to the media. So is that intrusive? Is that wrong? In a lot of the papers you see set-up pictures, which personally I really hate, but set-up pictures of somebody looking sadly at the deceased, or people, somehow the picture trying to reflect the emotion that's in the story. And that's a big area of debate as well. So these things are debate. And I would just want to keep moving along a little bit. We mentioned YouTube. In your guys' careers, you're going to be faced with a whole different world. I mean, Ted and I here, we're talking from a generation that was kind of in control of the news. Well, that control of the news is being lost by journalists and being lost by publishers. It's going out. The world is getting... Wikipedia is one of the most widely hit things on the net, and anybody can contribute to Wikipedia. So, you know, it's an attack on expertism. It's an attack on professionalism, and you know, the technology is taking things out of the hands and control. And I mean, I talked about, the major media won't run certain things. When this Federline video comes out, the marriage video with, the singer?
Oh, in Italy?
No. Ted, you're out of touch.
I know. Listen, can we truthful things?
Kevin Federline is threatening to release marriage, sex videos with Britney Spears. So, how long before that's going to get out? So, who's in control? The regular media may not run it. You won't see it on ABC or CBC, but there'll be a 10 million hits on YouTube, or 10 million hits. Well, now YouTube's been taken over by Google, so it's kind of is being reined in slightly. But something else is going to come up. So the world you guys live in is a completely different world. And I would love, though I won't be alive, unfortunately, but I would love in 30 or 40 years to come in, when you guys come into a class and you start talking about the world that you've lived in. It's going to be very interesting to see how you wrestle with all these issues. You may remember with some kind of affection at the charming concern that people used to have about not showing horrible pictures because they were in control of the media. So the whole thing is, the whole landscape is changing. There are no rules, really, and you guys kind of have to make it up as you go along. That's largely the truth of it, because you're going to be faced with a very different media landscape, I repeat myself, than that which Ted and I face.
So what should journalism carve out for itself then? I mean, it sort of has to recarve all the time, and now, with all this new technology and new media around, how should journalism define itself? Because if it doesn't, then it'll just be, it'll disappear in a sense, amid all these other forms of media or news or dissemination of images and information, whatever. How will you distinguish, between all of that and journalism? That's the question for you or anyone in the room.
Well, somebody has an answer, so.
Yeah, let's go.
It seems to me that news stories, I think that most of us agree should be in the public interest. And I've seen several things on CBC with disclaimers, and I think they've been good about warning people about graphic content, and I think that it serves a purpose most of the time. But the danger of like the Union Station thing, tons of news networks captured that, or at least several. I think CBC had it, City TV had it, and I think CTV had it. Like all the
big ones, yeah.
Come to Union Station, and the danger of showing things like that, like someone's head exploding after being shot. I think that if you get into a habit of showing that thing, I'm not sure you are serving the public interest, because part of what made the sound of the little girl in that excerpt we heard so effective is that it's so disturbing. And if you keep showing it, you might, keep showing things of that nature, you might be in danger of sort of desensitizing people. And if you're mitigating the disturbing nature of these things, people might sort of lose their appreciation of how wrong this is. And I think that if people get used to seeing heads blown up every night on the news, and it sort of gets to a point where they're not even disturbed by seeing it, I really don't see how you're serving the public interest. In some cases it's warranted, and I think it was well used on that radio excerpt, but I think that if you got into a habit of having extremely graphic violence and disturbing content every night on the news and just desensitizing the entire audience, I don't know how that's in the public interest.
Though I would say, I'd be interested if you agree with this, Ted, I would say that the boundary for what's acceptable is going up or going down, depends how you, but things that 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago might not have been acceptable are now becoming more and more acceptable in the general flow of major media. There seems to be a tendency in that direction. How far do we go? And, do people become desensitized when they see things, or is it just a matter of telling the truth? I mean, there's an argument out there that says you people who are in control of the media that should be wrestled from your hands because you're just servants of, some sort of bigger power or money or whatever. And I don't know the answer to that debate, but it's a debate that is going to become increasingly intense as the means of distributing information change and become more democratic, really.
I was just thinking, though, that if, in, say, using the example of the Union Station incident, let's assume then that somebody's put the most graphic images on YouTube, somebody else has put the most outlandish collection of opinion about the incident from any member of the public who wants to post it on the internet. So it's a sort of a, at worst, it's a sort of a free-for-all in terms of the kinds of communication that come from an incident. It's all out there on the internet. So I go back to my question, what's left for the journalist to contribute to that public discussion or to contribute to the publicizing about that event? There's got to be something left for the journalist, something that's different, unique, of more public value than seeing the person's head, you know, the bullet hit the head, or seeing someone express an opinion about what caused the incident, whatever. So I think that's a real difficult question we have to grapple with. What is the contribution that journalists can make? And I just want to use this just for an opportunity to maybe turn our attention maybe a little bit more to this police press conference, just as an example then, okay? I mean, the media, as the producer said there, went to that news conference in droves, and I'm sure they did. The police orchestrated a news conference. Big, powerful, secretive, important institution in our life, our society, the police. And yet still, here's the story of a person who ended up taking their own life afterward. We've seen one contribution by a journalist here today. It's a documentary, and it's an award-winning documentary, I'll say. But in the larger sense, for the rest of the media, for the rest of the journalists, what should journalism do then about a story like that? Is it just good enough to go to the press conference, do a story the next day? Just like there was a suicide at Yonge and Bloor last night on the subway, do a story the next day. You know, a 100-word story, someone committed suicide, typical story. And it finishes. Should it finish? So is there a contribution, do you think, that journalists could make that would be of some kind of value and substance? Using this as an illustration, this man's life here, James LaCroix, who got charged, charges got dropped, he ended his life, you know? What kind of story about that could we reasonably expect to see on YouTube or on Wikipedia or on any sort of website, as opposed to what kind of communication should we expect to see about that from a person who calls themselves a journalist and is a member of a profession?
Well, I think the answer I would give to that, which may differ from what you guys think, is that what we really have to sell as journalists is, and this is at the very core of the discussion we're having today, is that we come to events determined as best we can, using the medium we are using, to tell, you know, a fair and balanced story, to oversimplify it, to tell the truth. But that's kind of that's a big debatable issue. But the credibility of an organization, of an individual, is all they can bring. I mean, anything can be on YouTube. If it's completely unmediated, then who knows? Is it true? Is it fake? Is it, go down to the coffee shop, people have all sorts of stories to tell you that often are a slight distortion of what happened. For example, somebody was saying their cab driver told them that a cab driver was being shot every night, and police were keeping it under, they weren't letting people know about it. Well, I don't believe that, but clearly there's some people believe it, or they think it's a good story to tell somebody, and so on. So there's all sorts of rumors and things going around. And for a news organization, the only thing it can offer to the listener, the viewer, or the reader is that we'll do our best to try and tell you I'm just going to use a shorthand to get through this. We're going to do the best to bring you the truth as we see it, I suppose, I should say. So, I mean, and that's the very reason for the discussion here. You know, why don't you guys go say, you know, nobody's jumping up and saying, quit talking about ethics. I'm going to go out there and I'm just going to report it. Hell with you guys and your silly talk about ethics. But, you know, and I suppose there are people who might be prepared to do that. But most people want to belong to a credible organization, and they're ready to put their name and their careers and their livelihood on the line to do their very best to try to bring people credible information.
This is a very pessimistic question, I will say, but is there some danger, do you think, or all of us here think, that with all this other media, like YouTube and the internet and so on, that journalists will lose their audience to these other forms of media? What will prevent us from losing our audience?
I doubt it. I mean, those forms of media seem to be, they're like tabloids, but on the internet.
But do you hear
everybody's
these days,
slumping. The newspaper circulation is slumping.
yeah, and young people don't read the paper. This is what we hear, right?
TV ratings at the formal networks are slumping.
Is that because they're getting their news from the internet, or is it because they just don't care?
Or they're getting their news from people who
John
aren't.
TV, or
Are
like
they-
satirical shows? Like, is it that they don't care about the news, or is it that they're getting their news from the internet? I don't know a lot of people who don't read the newspaper but read the online newspaper. You know what I mean? Like, it seems like
We're kind of in a way, we're the worst people to ask because we're all kind of committed into the news thing one way or the other. But
Yeah, but
we hear that.
my housemates who don't care about the news whatsoever don't go online to get the news. They don't watch the news. They don't read newspapers. They go online to get porn videos of Paris Hilton or jokes or whatever. They don't go online to get news. It's not like YouTube is destroying their commitment to newspapers. It was never there to begin with.
Okay, so what should journalists do to reach those people? Your housemates.
My housemates? I don't know.
This is a question I'm grappling with. I have children who don't read the news. Yes.
Things like YouTube and posting videos and stuff, like, it really just serves, it's like a very small segment that serves to show these sensational acts that big media like CBC or CTV won't show. But these people are just regular people with their camera phones and, you know, they're just taking short clips of videos. Like, they don't have the resources to actually put money behind to have a credible news outlet showing these sensational things all the time. Like, people, when 9/11 happened, people happened to have, like, a little camera phone, like, took a little video of someone jumping out the building when it was, like, bursting on flames. Like, they don't, that person doesn't have the money or resources to finance a whole news corporation to keep showing things like this all the time. So I don't think it's going to put journalists or a corporation out of business because these people aren't doing this for the sake of reaching huge audiences. They're just putting it up on the internet because they have it. It's not something I don't think they're seeking out to find. I don't think people are looking to every suicide jumping to get video of it, or every suicide to get video of that and put it online. They happen to be there and get it.
Can I just interject for 1 second? I know we're having an interesting discussion here, but I know that just because of the time here, 20 minutes officially left, I think Geoff had a few other things on his list he wanted to talk about, and I don't want to run out of time for those things. I also had asked him to talk a little bit about the law, not just ethics. Subjects like publication bans and relationships with the police these days in Toronto, between the media and the police. Do you mind if I move on then for a minute? I think it's important maybe to do so. We might be able to come back.
Sure.
Yeah.
Anyways, I find it really interesting to hear what you guys are saying because, you know, every time we have a meeting at the CBC, you say, how can we reach younger listeners? How can we get there? And in a way, you guys are you're the wrong sample because you probably, you know, if we talked about what, you've probably always been interested in news or you liked certain things or you like reading physical active reading newspapers, whatever. Anyway, I find it very interesting. I thank you for being so frank in some of your suggestions. Okay, the question about publication bans. Does everyone know what a publication ban is? What's a publication ban?
Well, it's just basically where information cannot be published until a certain time when normally related to personal
Do you think publication bans are fair or right?
It depends on the case, depends on who's involved, like how many, who the victim or witnesses are, who the criminal, alleged criminal.
Do you think publication bans contribute to justice? I'm sorry, I don't know anybody's name. Forgive me for pointing.
Well, I mean, it depends on the case again. I would say in sexual harassment cases that publication bans are needed, especially for the victims.
Yes.
I think that one strong argument in favor of publication bans is that, you know, in the States the jury is sequestered throughout the trial. And I mean, I think it's nice that Canadian jurors don't have to be, like, they'll be sequestered, I understand, when they actually deliberate the verdict, but not throughout the entire trial. So, I mean, it serves a purpose in that sense, that they're not going to go home and be exposed to prejudicial information. And I know that a lot of media outlets tend to oppose them, but I mean, I think that's one reasonable justification without saying I'm in favor or against it.
I should tell Geoff, we listened a few weeks ago to the interview with Danny Henry on the terrorist, the effort to get the publication ban lifted on the bail hearings. And it makes me wonder whether there's a very concerted strategy now at the CBC to fight all the publication bans pretty well. But just a thought.
I think there is.
I think one thing to sort of favor just getting rid of publication bans is it's sort of saying as well, if the jury, you know, if in Canada they're only sequestered until they make the final verdict, that means if they go home, then, you know, the court will obviously feel like the, you know, newspapers are responsible enough to give fair and balanced coverage, because if there is that sort of coverage, then you know, it shouldn't influence a bias at all. The problem is that the newspapers do tend to have, you know, writers or columnists that sort of inject their own opinions that need sway. So that's interesting too. You know, have enough faith.
I just want to clear something about publication bans. In these terrorist cases, these are special cases where there is sort of a blanket the blanket varies, but a publication ban on proceedings. Most trials are public trials. Most trials are held in the public forum and are covered. What they don't want reporters to do is start speculating on what's going to happen in the future. And one person who seems to have attracted, I think, both admiration and criticism from the judiciary is the very influential columnist Christy Blatchford, who writes tremendously well, reaches inside to the kind of inside people. It's very powerful writing, and some people in the judiciary think that because her columns are so powerful, they're accusing her of powerful writing, I guess, but because they're so powerful, that they might influence a juror who read the newspaper. And most jurors are directed, don't read the newspaper and don't watch television coverage of this particular incident, but, you know, human beings are human beings. The thing about publication bans is that, you know, it's interesting you mentioned Danny Henry. Danny Henry is kind of on the side of people who want to open the courts to the media more. I tend to be on the side, I'm a more conservative in that point of view, because the thing which really concerns me is not so much the interests of the media, not so much the interests of the media and thus the public, but it's the interests of the accused. And the argument goes, for example, as somebody goes through the normal course, if I'm repeating stuff you've been over 10 times, forgive me, but as somebody goes through the normal course of going through the courts, they start off, for example, they go to bail court. And in bail court, a justice of the peace, not a judge, but a justice of the peace, asks the defense and the Crown, what should we do with this person? Should we keep them in custody or should we let them go? And because it's early in the process, because the investigation hasn't been completed, the Crown will say, the police allege that this man was found doing such and such and such and such and such and such. They don't have any proof of that. These are allegations early in the process. Then the defense, on the other hand, will say that, you know, this is a very good fellow, he didn't do it, and he's going to plead not guilty, and he shouldn't be held in custody. We're dealing with the most fundamental issue in a society. We're talking about a person's freedom. You know, literally their freedom about whether they're going to be free to go outside and do as they want or be held in custody. It's right at it's the very core of a free society. Freedom means that you can go out the door. Not being free means you can't go out the door. So we're talking about a very fundamental thing. And it happens in a very kind of, I don't know if you guys been to bail courts. It's a very kind of rock and roll, lots of people coming in and out and so on. Now what happens in bail court is typically the accused has a right to ask for a publication ban. Why would they ask for a publication ban? Many reasons, perhaps, but one reason is they don't want all these allegations coming from the police and the Crown to be published and thus sully the waters for any future trial that may be held. So there's a publication ban on that, on the bail hearing. The next step in the process, well, it's not exactly the next step, but the next major step in a serious crime is called a preliminary hearing. There's a publication ban on a preliminary hearing because what happens in a preliminary hearing is the Crown presents its case. And the idea is the judge decides if the Crown has a reasonable prospect of getting a conviction. Not going to get a conviction, but a reasonable prospect of getting a conviction. So they listen to what the Crown has to say. The defense doesn't have to say anything. The defense can cross-examine the witnesses if they wish, but they listen to it. There's a publication ban on that. Why is there a publication ban? Because A, it may not go to trial, which raises another issue, but anyway. A, it may not go to trial, and B, if you start reporting on what the witnesses say and what everybody says in the preliminary, that may sully the waters to have more or less clean trial in the end. Then the next step typically is that there is a trial. If the judge decides it should go forward, there's a trial. A trial is an open trial, a public trial, and can be reported on with various little prohibitions, which I'm sure you've been through or you go through. Anyway, but basically it's an open trial, a public trial, and we want to have open trials and public trials because we don't want secret trials. And that's one of the big problems with these terrorist things is that the competing interests have resulted in essentially secret trials. So that's a normal course, and that's where the publication bans tend to come in play. You raise the issue about child victims and underage people. Tends to be publication bans. There are normally publication bans on their names and identifying them. And we saw a recent example actually. The only way that the media can report on the name of a underage victim or an accused is if the parents give permission. And we saw the incident, the Jonathan trial. You may recall that throughout the trial, he was referred to as Jonathan, as Jonathan, as Jonathan. Now, we had an odd situation there because the victim was related to the accused. But in the end, when the trial was over, the mother said, I want people to know who my son is. He was a person. He wasn't just Jonathan. He was Jonathan, I forget the last name.
Snedden, I think.
Snedden.
Yeah.
And
So
was vital to her to humanize Jonathan, her son.
So you take a conservative view.
I do.
On the publication.
And now, if Dan Henry was here, he would much more persuasively argue the other side, I'm sure.
Just, we have a few minutes left, and I did want to leave time for a few general questions if you have them, guys, okay? Just let us know, okay? But on a practical scale, with the covering the courts and covering the police these days, maybe with the police especially, do you get the sense that the police and their ability to manage the media is growing and becoming more sophisticated? And is there a need, perhaps, for the media, the crime reporters and so forth, to be perhaps more conservative or more critical of what they do? Going back once again to our news conference here, I can't help but feel, that it's the authorities in control here, and there's a lot of managing going on the part of the authorities, and a lot of following by members of the media. Or am I being unfair?
Sure. No, there is no doubt that the police are. They have complete control of the news, right? They've talked to the witnesses. They've got everything. They don't want to say too much sometimes because they're concerned about it interfering with a subsequent trial. They may want to say lots at sometimes. It's up to them. They have all the information so they can decide. If they're after somebody, particularly in the pedophile or that kind of area. So it's important that the media play a role of, and the police are one of society's most important institutions. You know, the reason I mean, you know, I said freedom is whether you can go out the door or not. While it is a debate within certain areas, I would argue that the freedom to safely sit in a room and safely say what's within the law is a freedom. And the reason we can do that is because there's cops out there maintaining order. So, you know, they're a vital instrument in maintaining freedom. But on the other hand, the police have to be very carefully monitored, and they have to be tested, and they have to know that they can't step beyond the bounds without receiving public scrutiny. We've talked about YouTube today. Have you guys seen that LAPD clip where the guy is punching a guy who's lying? So that's caused a lot of, you know, but again, it's classic YouTube. We don't know what led up to it. We don't know what followed. We don't know the extent of the injuries or anything. But there is an incident where it appears at first blush that the cops were perhaps using too much force. So it becomes kind of a salutary lesson for other cops. You've got to watch out. Don't punch some guy out because somebody may videotape it. But then right now there's Otto Voss before the courts. Could very well have been a case of police using too much force. The guy who died while being arrested, and the coroner's inquest. Yeah, the inquest is underway right now. So, but just get to the point very quickly, and that is that the police must be held to test at all times. And there's a guy working in our newsroom who's doing a terrific job, Dave Seglins, who's done a terrific job of searching out and following the police and following sometimes the dull routine of various hearings and disciplinary hearings, and following the paper trail. And he has broken some stories in which he's stayed right on top of the police, and he's forced the police to go into to more rigorously police themselves. And that seems to me to be the pure role of the journalist. Teja, we're talking about the roles of the journalist. One of the roles of the journalist is a social role. And the social role is to say, let everybody know is, hey, there's somebody out here watching. It is easy, particularly when dealing with the police, because lots of them are nice middle-class fellows just like you and me. It's easy to get drawn into a situation of becoming friends with the police, not wanting to tread on toes. You can't, if you give them too hard a time, then the time you phone them up and you really want to know something, you really want to get a little kind of extra on something, people aren't going to go, well, I heard that such and such is happening, or you're going to break down that relationship. And some newsrooms actually have a kind of a cop-friendly person, and then the cop-critical person, which can work or not work, but it is a possibility. So certainly, when it comes to watching the police, to policing the police, that is an example where a responsible media person who's not just looking for the sensational tape, someone who's prepared to do the boring, tiresome work that's needed to get somewhere, that is where they play a very, very important social role. And if typically when you start, you're going to be starting in a small town, and you're going to deal so often the relationships between small-town newspapers, small-town media outlets, and the police is kind of like a big brother and a little brother. And so it's important to play that social role and watch. The whole world is watching, and the whole world's watching through our eyes. That's not going to change.
I have a comment, but any questions? I'd rather take a question. But at CBC Radio, then, if you have someone like Dave Seglins, who is doing these hard-hitting stories on the police, how do you foster that other kind of relationship as well, so that someone can phone the police and get cooperation on a routine story? you simply have other reporters like yourself doing that.
Right. I mean, I work the morning beat a lot, so lots of times I'm working with detectives or staff sergeants in the places, and generally, they're under certain constraints too, and of course, they don't want to screw up any subsequent any subsequent investigation or court case. But you know, it's like anything. If you deal like a human being with somebody, and you just ask them for usually small clarifications on things, they'll usually be cooperative if you speak to them in a normal kind of way.
It is almost 20 after, and I'd just like to thank Geoff very much for coming here today. Is there any closing message you'd like to share with the students, or any closing comment that anyone might like to make before we break up? We've got 1 second.
Well, I just say to you guys that, you know, it's a great business. It's a great business, and I hope it works out for you. Ted has gone into the most difficult area of ethics, or really no clear answers here, other than that. I guess this professional thing that you guys have decided to take formal training, which is great. People sometimes just learn these things at the, in the newsroom.